who are investing in infrastructure. The way we look at infrastructure sustainability is broadly in four big areas. If you look at how things have been evolving, climate change and infrastructure sector is getting linked in a very intense way, because most of the infrastructure projects, in addition to having huge economic impact, also have strong environment impact. And that is where the clean energy as a new energy form is becoming very, very critical. Now, if you look at what's happening in the energy transition, there's a confluence of three things which are driving the energy transition. One is moving from fossil fuel to more renewable energy. And in this regard, I must say that 2019 was quite a landmark year, where globally the aggregate renewable energy capacity addition, which is comprising of wind, solar, tidal, geothermal, has exceeded for the first time the aggregate capacity addition due to fossil fuel. This, to my mind, is quite a tipping point, and over the years we'll see more and more renewable energy coming in as the cost becomes more grid competitive. The second aspect is the waste management, and this is where I think a lot of urban cities have to start looking at how waste to energy can be an effective solution for the waste management problem and converting into green power. Now, Singapore has been on the forefront for this, and we have done a fair bit of waste to energy in Singapore. Now is probably the right opportunity for the regional capital cities like Manila and Jakarta to pick up this in a big way. And finally, the third angle to clean energy is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency has started to make a lot of sense across corporate sectors, primarily because this is not only being green and being a responsible corporate, but because it makes financial commercial sense. So across industries, we have seen a lot of energy efficiency projects being implemented to optimize on power consumption and hence become competitive in the cost. The second aspect of the Sustainable Development Goals, if you look at the 17 SDGs, close to 2/3 of those are related to infrastructure in some fashion or the other. And this is where we believe that if we have to achieve the SDGs, we'll have to get a sustainable infrastructure going, which will benefit from green aspects. The third angle is the technology angle. Now, because the technology costs have come down so much with the use of IoT devices, remote monitoring, the drones, it is becoming increasingly easier for emerging markets and countries in Southeast Asia to take a technology leap and see how technology can make infrastructure delivery more efficient. We have seen use of technology from conceptualization to project construction development to even operational improvement. And this, to our mind, is the biggest opportunity, given the fact that not a lot of infrastructure projects in the region are necessarily operating at the optimized levels. With the technology monitoring tools that we have in our access, we can actually drive a better utilization of infrastructure, better monitoring, and better operation and maintenance of critical infrastructure like utility services. And finally, the ESG risk management is critical for ensuring that we are resilient in the face of crises like the one we are currently facing. If you look at the distinction between countries which have managed this crisis better and countries which have not, we have seen that people who were conscious about the ESG risk and the technology integration into projects have actually come out much stronger. The working from home, the remote monitoring and maintenance of critical infrastructure has been quite a strain in the current crisis. And without technology leverage, it would have been very, very difficult for many companies to continue to operate at the level that they've operated during this pandemic. So we believe going forward, the successful countries will be those who will be implementing projects which are environmentally sustainable, socially impactful, and have a degree of resilience to face any crisis that may come up in the future. If we move to the next slide, and this is something which I wanted to substantiate some of the discussion we had by way of numbers. If you look at the growth rate in the renewable energy, which is the first graph on the left, there has been almost 80% compounded annual growth rate in the renewable energy capacity addition between 2012 to 2019. And this is quite a huge jump in the renewable energy. This is primarily driven not only by the fact that there's a huge demand, but the supply has increased quite a lot of solar panels, for example, or wind turbines, and the costs have consistently come down. So much so that nowadays renewable energy is even lower in terms of tariff compared to traditional power plants. The second important thing is how the corporates have moved together to drive the climate agenda. And if you look at how companies in S&P 500, for example, are reporting at the board level on climate issues, the number has increased in the last 7-8 years from 50% to 73%. We wouldn't be surprised if it reaches close to 100% in the next 5 to 10 years. And finally, which is most important, is where is the money going? If you look at the huge capital available with multilaterals, the institutional investors, the pension funds, bulk of them is getting directed towards sustainable infrastructure, sustainable green financing. And we have looked at the availability of financing for these projects growing from 14.8 billion to actually 465 billion, which gives a CAGR of not too different from what we saw in the renewable energy over the last 7-8 years. If you go to the next slide, we will see how this is all impacting us closer home. Now, in Singapore, we have actually set a target of 2 gigawatt of solar being installed over the next few years. We have seen the floating solar being installed. The rooftop solar program has been hugely a success. And 40 to 45% of our electricity may one day in the daytime can be supplied by solar clean green finance. Multilaterals, as I say, like Asian development banks, have started funding a number of projects in the renewable energy space as well as the battery storage space, because as battery storage becomes more and more cost competitive, we will see the penetration of renewable increasing in the grid. Most of the utilities in the region have committed to put 20 to 25% of their grid capacity as renewable energy, and that is a big thumbs up for the renewable energy progress in the region. So Vietnam is an example where in the last 4 years, we have added more than 4 gigawatts of solar energy in a short time frame. And this is testimony to the fact that if the government can put its policies correctly, there's enough and more capital resources available to drive the renewable energy growth in a country. Indonesia has already started working on the renewable energy space, as well as the waste to energy will become critical as countries and cities run out of landfill areas for dumping waste. So the more efficient and sustainable way of managing waste, that is waste to energy, will become prevalent in most cities in the region. If we go to the next slide, we look at how the quantum of opportunity is looking like. Now, according to various studies, and this we have quoted one of the reports which was come out on financing sustainable infrastructure in ASEAN, the infrastructure gap of 2.8 trillion has been projected, which comes to around $184 billion of investment. Now, what is interesting is close to 60% of these projects will be actually green finance potential, meaning that they will be able to comply with the sustainability requirements and attract green finance, which we talked about earlier. The Asia's power sector climate adjusted investment need is also estimated at 8.4 trillion. And this is where all the renewable energy, the sustainable energy comes in, where a fair bit of investments could happen to tap on the green finance, the capital that's available can be leveraged. Now, if you move to the slide number 7, and this is an important slide and is a trend that we talked about a little bit earlier, where between 2000 to 2018, the renewable energy capacity addition per year was slightly lower than gas and coal. And by renewable energy, we mean everything from solar to wind to hydro to all the geothermal and other energy sources. But what is interesting, in the next 2 decades, the per year addition of renewable energy capacity is going to be much more than gas and or coal. And this is where the real opportunity lies of greening the energy value chain or the energy transition that we are looking at. If you move to the next one, we wanted to present what is happening in the Singapore clean green energy space. As most of us know that carbon tax has been introduced in Singapore, with $5 now, which may increase to 10 and 15 over the coming years. Now, this is a good way to monitor, evaluate, and pay taxes on the carbon emitted from the top 5 polluting industries in Singapore, and brings a responsible behavior and thoughts on how to optimize the incidence of tax on those industries. There is also initiative by MAS on green finance solutions, and a $2 billion green fund is launched to support those initiatives. We heard our Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister talk about the Coastal Protection Fund in this year's budget, where a $5 billion have been put together to help Singapore manage the rising sea levels. And Public Utilities Board has been identified as an agency that will drive this agenda for the government. This should lead to multiple opportunities for all the players in Singapore. The government has been, of course, sustainably investing in climate action, and a $2.7 billion fund with a strong green focus has been put forward, again, to ensure that the projects that we are talking about can fall in place and the funding is made available to them. And finally, the infrastructure finance hub of ASEAN. Close to 60% of financing that happens in ASEAN region goes through Singapore. The entire ecosystem of players are based in Singapore. And that is where the setting up of infrastructure Asia is a great step forward to facilitate not only financing, but also the best practices relating to contracting and sustainable development. If you go to the next slide, which identifies the commercial opportunities of sustainable infrastructure. We have tried to capture in one picture here on what are the various opportunities that companies can look for. We have talked about renewables. We are already looking at new alternate fuels coming up, including the clean and green hydrogen as a fuel potentially in the next 5 to 10 years, which Singapore could leverage. We're talking of energy efficiency across value chain in all the industries, particularly heavy energy consuming industries. So there's a green finance available for energy efficiency measures which are being implemented. A lot of advanced materials are being invented on a regular basis, which will offer opportunities for better storage technology, for example, from lithium-ion batteries to some other advanced technologies, which will make storage cheaper and hence increase the penetration of renewable energy. And the preservation and environmental markets in terms of recycling initiatives, as well as helping improve environmental technologies would be critical in years to come. What is important is most of the countries in the region are looking at factors and policies which will facilitate this framework. But what is influencing this is not only the technology availability, but also the demand from technology companies like Facebook, Amazon, Google, which are insisting that the data centers that they set up in any country in the region are green data centers tapping on renewable energy. So there is a demand and there is a supply, which will essentially ensure that the infrastructure of the future will be driven by renewable green technologies. Which now brings me to my slide, which sums up the discussion that we had so far. And before we get to the next section, the key takeaways is clean energy is the new norm. So companies that are involved in either providing clean energy solutions or using clean energy solutions are going to benefit. And we are looking at both off-grid solutions as well as hybrid solutions to help penetrate the renewable energy as an industry. We talked about municipal waste as well as energy efficiency, which are going to be big business opportunities for companies in Singapore. The Sustainable Development Goals will continue to be a key priority, and a lot of funding will be made available by governments and multilateral agencies for achieving those goals. Bulk of this, as we said, lies in the infrastructure space. And if we can construct clean and green infrastructure, it will help us achieve those goals that we have set up for ourselves. In this instance, I would say that the involvement of cooperatives and local enterprises is becoming increasingly important in countries like Indonesia and Philippines, where a lot of remote areas are now getting access to water, electricity, which is very important for alleviating poverty. And finally, technology is playing a very important role. Infratech, smart cities, smart infrastructure is becoming the key focus. I think automation and digital transformation offers a huge opportunity for all the countries in the region to leapfrog into the next stage of development by having more efficient infrastructure delivered. So with that, I will pause for a moment. Happy to take questions before we move to the next section. So if you could put the next slide. We always have this question that, hey, now that we are in a pandemic, will sustainability take a backstage? Will it be forgotten for years to come as people want to get their business on stream? I will invite Korodo's view here before he takes on the next section. Korodo?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Sharad, for sharing some of your insights. I can answer by referring to an article I was reading this morning from BBC on 100 top UK firms and investors going together and actually calling on the government to make sure that they can use COVID-19 to deliver a more sustainable plan ahead. So this is one way of reading it and answering the question, but I also see a potential dilemma here. And it's that the dilemma of that at one stage, COVID-19 has definitely created a better visibility on a crossroad that we need to cross from something that we are used to into a clean energy type of road. But on the other side, I think we have as well visibility, or probably lack of visibility, on what are the consequences, because we haven't really yet seen the impact of COVID in terms of economic returns. But what we start seeing is actually the surge of nationalism. We start having concerns around destabilization. We have a surge of liquidity and credit risk that we start planning for. So how will this dilemma possibly slow down or accelerate the sustainability? I really much think it depends on our ability to actually work together on a common goal and using a common language. So the session I will present in a few moments will actually be a bit around this common language and how we can use it as a way of crossing the road in a more resilient and safe way than if we were not approaching it from an ESG perspective.
Korodo, if I can just add to that, we recently did a survey of a lot of institutional investors, and one of the key things that came out is sustainability will actually be on the top of the agenda for most investors, most boards, and most portfolio companies that they invest in. Yep. So I think, interestingly, people believe that this pandemic has actually opened our eyes to the fact that we have to be much more resilient and much more conscious about sustainability aspects as we implement projects. Now, there's a question, if I may take quickly, is what are the challenges of implementation when a large amount of green capital is available? Why there's not much of capital flowing in countries, for example, like Indonesia? If I can take that question quickly, there are a few challenges. While a lot of funds is available, I think making the right projects available has been a sustainable challenge for countries. What I mean by that is, first is, what is ESG compliant project? And I think Korodo is going to talk a little bit more about that, but a common definition within the project is missing. The second is we need to ensure that there's a robust pipeline of sustainable projects is offered in a very transparent fashion, so that institutional investors who operate above board on all aspects are comfortable looking at those projects and investing in it. We work very closely in Indonesia, and we are involved in a waste to energy project as well as renewable energy projects. The third challenge to our mind is the pipeline of projects available. I think what countries like Indonesia need to do is, given the quantum of funding available, we need to actually structure a number of projects that can be offered on a very consistent basis as a platform or as a pipeline, so that institutional investors can actually look at it in a more holistic fashion. Fact of the matter is, most of the green infrastructure projects or renewable energy projects may be small in size, but if we can offer a few bundled projects, it will actually interest the institutional investors quite a lot. So that's what my view would be.
Yeah, and Sharad, we got two more questions. One from Hayden. And Hayden, if you allow me, I can address the questions during my session because it's a little bit around the work we are doing as well on strategizing for success. And Sharad, you have a question from Jinkit.
Yeah, are there enough green projects? So I talked about that. I think the number of good green projects coming, increasingly the number of projects is increasing, but the size continues to be small. We are looking at $20 million to $50 million kind of projects, which are off-grid solutions, mini-grid solutions, energy efficiency projects, rooftop solar kind of projects, which are coming up. And I think, as I said, we need more of such projects to be available so that the ecosystem can be activated in an efficient fashion. There's also a question on role of Singapore, role in the part towards sustainability, the KPMG's role, and how do KPMG plan to do that in the next 5 to 10 years. I think as a responsible, sustainable corporate, we have very strong goals on sustainability. Globally, we drive a sustainability team, which is not only looks at helping our clients be sustainable, but internally how KPMG reduces the carbon footprint is a big agenda. We have committed to a number of goals within KPMG globally. And in fact, in the next few days, we are launching a very big program on how all the sustainable solutions will have a big impact on corporates across the value chain. So we'll be happy to discuss as we move forward.
Yeah, and then we have one question from Noel, and I can take that one. Yes, okay. There is an increasing pressure to look not only at the environmental emission type of dimension only, but increasingly the social aspect, including then the health. So yes, COVID-19 and the fact that you see a correlation of pollution and fatality rate being actually proven in some of the countries like the northern part of Italy, where pollution has been very much related to the fact that you had such a high fatality rate, is definitely adding pressure to corporates, mainly from government, to do something. So it's a bit a call of action that now has been proven by the COVID-19 situation.
The two more questions, if we can take before Corrado, we can move on to your section if it's okay.
Yeah.
The first one was on FIT regime in Indonesia. I think I agree with that. There's a lot to be desired because compared to other countries like Thailand, Philippines, and Vietnam, Indonesia has not necessarily leveraged its renewable energy potential to the extent it could have. Having said that, PLN has now started to put its act together, and we are expecting four big solar projects that KPMG is actually helping them run coming up in the market very soon. There's one waste to energy project that is happening. I think once the proof of concept happens in terms of a pilot project, the rest of the things will start falling in place, is our belief. But I agree with that the policies have to be strengthened to attract investors in the renewable energy space in Indonesia. And hopefully with the precedents that will happen in the next few months, it will get a kickstart. There's a quick question on hydrogen as a fuel. NCCS has actually commissioned a study to look at potential of clean and green hydrogen in the Singapore's ecosystem. We in KPMG have been working quite closely in countries like Australia and Japan, which are on the forefront of hydrogen as a fuel development. I think the cost economics are not expected to work in the next 5 to 10 years. We believe that the research that's happening in this space to optimize the cost, once it becomes comparable to LNG as a fuel, then the hydrogen would be a very great clean and green fuel to fire up our infrastructure. So clearly in 10 years time, you will see a fair bit of hydrogen happening in Singapore, if not earlier. Okay, over to you, Corrado, for your section.
Yeah, there is just another question from Jinkit. I can take it on the size of the project. True, but I think is to answer the question is the comfort that investors do have in looking for comparability. And I think that's where ESG and what we're going to cover now in the next session can actually be used as well from small startups and unlisted project and similar to build a common language that will be understood and thereby comparable. Yeah, so I'm actually, you are right, but I see a path towards that is actually encouraging towards allowing a better comparability and thereby access to funding as well for smaller projects. right? So is COVID-19 the tipping point for the clean energy transition? Well, I probably already alluded to the fact that I personally, I do see a bit of a dilemma right now, and the dilemma is the fact that COVID-19 is definitely giving us a sense of urgency. If we haven't had that before, is adding to that sense of urgency by making more visible the fact that we have a crossroad that we will have to cross in order to make our economy more circular and more electrified, more green and clean. But on the other side, when I can't stop wondering what is the geopolitical shift and thereby the consequences that that transition will mean for some of the countries, like US, for example, and thereby how will the transition actually look like when countries may start being more national in the way they are thinking, more protective, might look into civil unrest as we are looking, just now we are witnessing what is happening in US. Would we have similar protests possibly accelerating or delaying the transition? I don't know. Those are actually open questions that I think we will have to face. But definitely COVID-19, in the way it is giving us a sense of what the new normal will look like, even though, again, we might not really see through fully how the economical impact in terms of protectionism, nationalism, civil unrest may look like, and may potentially actually delay the transition into clean energy. So whether COVID-19 is really a tipping point, I really believe it depends on our ability and willingness to learn, speak, and practice a common language. And that's what my session is all about. So if, Tiana, if you're moving to, yeah, so you can see the common language in Asian, we start believing that ESG is actually building up as a language that will facilitate and improve and enhance the understanding of potential risk and uncertainties. And I think if I should give it in a very simple way, I think we are moving from a language based on financial terms. So we are really much financial driven. So I think we can easily agree what a good project looks like from a financial return perspective. But we are not that good yet to understand how a clean energy transition project may look good from a non-financial risk perspective. And I think that's where, in order to help the session and making it a little bit practical for you to remember, I think the way I like to look at this common language in Asian is to look at a language that is fair to understand, where F stands for focus on risk mitigation. And I think this is a very important statement from an ESG perspective, that for sustainable finance, the mitigation of risk is a key proposition. So F stands for focus on risk mitigation. The A stands for assessing risk and opportunities around the ESG by putting up a new language and giving new perspective to do the assessment of a certain project. The I is actually identifying the implications that you will have by speaking the common language of ESG. And we will go a bit more in detail on some of those implications so that you get an understanding what I'm talking about. And the R, the result, is basically actually securing the funding necessary, the green finance, what Kavita was actually asking Sharad. The result is really to secure that finance so that you can have sufficient capital and funding and liquidity to actually transit into a clean energy economy. So if everything else from my presentation, if you don't remember, then to me, ESG is a fair language. It's focus on risk mitigation, is assessment of risk and opportunities, is identifying the implications of that exercise, with the result that we really want is to secure funding. Yeah. And that can be incorporated in all the stages of the life cycle of an asset. And this is really regardless whether that asset is a physical asset, or you yourself find being supplier, EPC, contractor to that particular project. It doesn't really matter, because it will look into your impact, your fair impact and understanding of the language. And of course, that language may have some local flavor. And I think that's where you have Singaporean Singlish dialects coming up, and that's an important aspect to the ESG common language. We are not. I don't feel and believe that ESG is a universal language that will be spoken, understood equally everywhere, because you will have local context that you need to take into account, and that's an important prerogative of the work that KPMG also is conducting in that space. So on the next slide. This is a bit giving you an understanding of how to incorporate the ESG throughout the asset lifecycle of a project. And in order to give you a little bit, probably, if I should give you a bit an analogy. So tomorrow the circuit breaker will actually end. So picture this. Imagine that you will be taking your petrol fuel car tomorrow and drive to work. And we are approaching this crossroad where you have many other cars on the street, because they are all going to work after the circuit breaker. They all are very busy to go back to work and generate some revenue, so financial result. The crossroad is actually having traffic lights, but they are not working, but they are keep on, so they're flashing. So they're flashing orange, so they're just telling you to be careful. The traffic officers are deployed, but they are actually busy in making sure that everyone is respecting the rules of social distancing and whatever. And you're doing this every day going forward. And I start already feeling a bit anxious about it myself. So think about ESG as a way of, defining a strategy on how to best cross that road going forward. And the more I'm thinking about it now, speaking to you, I'm actually seeing it that ESG and the language and sustainable finance maybe is all about changing and reshaping that crossroad from a traditional crossroad with traffic light, traffic officers, a lot of cars that they need to figuring out how to regulate themselves to cross the road safely, to a roundabout. Maybe roundabout is really what clean energy transition is about, is building roundabouts that will facilitate the transition from the economy that we see today into an economy that is much more self-regulated. I'm from Europe, so and my parents are living in France, and France is one of the countries where I see most of the roundabouts, and it's probably from an ESG perspective, is the country that is actually much more even enforcing ESG upon companies, despite the fact that roundabout, again, per definition, they are self. You organize yourself to cross it. So to me, if you're looking into strategy development, delivering on metrics, assessing your impact when you're approaching a roundabout on other drivers being the supply chain, and thereby defining the way you are driving your car compared to crossing a road without any traffic light, without any help from traffic officers. How would that feel like? And I think if everyone is able to speak that language, that common language, it will probably bring us to an easier way of, as Kavita was mentioning at the very beginning, of engaging banks and investors. Because all of a sudden we will be understanding better what are the metrics and what are the rules and what are the baselines that will actually be helping us in driving safely without having too many regulations, too many rules, too many fines, too many incidents, and so forth and so on. So I think this idea of ESG being a language, and the idea that you can actually speak that language throughout the life cycle of a particular asset is a very strong argument for securing the finance of the future being green. So if you want a statement beyond the fair statement, the other statement I will make is probably sustainable finance. This is actually what it's all about, is to help transforming a traditional crossroad with many cars, with all type of infrastructure that is needed but may not be functioning well, into a roundabout. Yeah, and I think if you like that analogy, then probably you start understanding how I'm thinking about the whole thing. If we're moving into the next slide, this is again from the assessment of the risk and opportunity, and this is really not rocket science, and it's just to give you a flavor, since we will have a series of webinars around sustainable finance, but just to give you a flavor on some of the risk and opportunities component in terms of environmental, social governance that will be important for you to identify the implications. And the implications are measured in terms of cost and compliance primarily. So when you're looking at ESG implication, you might ask yourself, why am I doing this? I will probably have an impact on my cost. True, but you might mitigate your risk on the compliance side. You might challenge and saying the implications might not be visible on the income because I need to satisfy the return and the shareholder expectations. True, but think about how you can secure your capital for the future. So I think you will have to, in the language of ESG and sustainability, you will have to understand the dynamics between the elements and the dimensions that you have, because transiting into a clean energy is not for free. It will require investment. It will require funding. It will require a common language and a common approach. And therefore, the importance of understanding the risk and opportunities in terms of implications is what you need to achieve the result of securing finance. Yeah, so you see the journey of being fair, the fairness of the language by focusing on the risk mitigation. So we want to cross the road safely. That is one of the proposition. So how to cross the road safely? Then we want to assess what are the risks and opportunities if we decide to cross the road without any rules and traffic lights and officers helping us, vis-a-vis the opportunities of having a roundabout type of structure. You want to identify the implications, again, cost, compliance, capital, income. You want to understand how will those be impacted positively and negatively by speaking a common language. Finally, because you want to secure your finance and your funding and your capital, right? So I think we can open up for some questions, but I really wanted to give you a flavor and a framework, maybe more, of what ESG is about in terms of language to engage banks, investors, supply chains, actors, stakeholders more in general, based on the fact that you will be actually looking into different type of phases with the overall strategy of how to change and how to move from a more rule-based type of crossroad into a roundabout type of structure, where you will look into having a common goal, whether the common goal is to electrify the economy or the common goal is actually to make it much more circular than what it is today. So I think I will stop. I will pause here and open up for questions.
Thank you so much, Gerardo, for sharing. As mentioned, we allow opening up for Q&A. If you have any questions, either post in the chat box, or you just click on the raise hand function, and I'll mute you to post the question accordingly.
So I can start taking the one that I promised Hayden to reply. I hope it's okay, because you asked a little bit what is our role in the path towards sustainable renewable energy, and I think the road is really how can we actually help changing and moving from a traditional crossroad into a roundabout by learning how to speak and practice the language of ESG. So there is a strategy, there is development of criteria, there is following up on some of the indicators, and finally it's actually all about how to position a company to secure the capital and the funding of the future. Then we got a question from, let me see. We have a question from my good friend Peter. Hi, Peter. Yes. So the question from Peter, as you can probably see in the chat, is whether we do sense an appetite for more regional approach to infrastructure development. I think this is the case with Infrastructure Asia, driven out from Singapore. Going back to my analogy, I think this is an effort of all, it's not an effort of few. But I also see the dilemma, as I mentioned in my initial statement, the dilemma of looking for sustainability while not knowing really how each and one of the countries might react to different trends or phenomena in their own, home base, being civil unrest, nationalism, and protectionism. But I definitely see the development continuing on a more regional level, especially here in Asia.
If I can just make one point while we wait for other questions, and thank you, Corrado, for that comprehensive presentation as well. I believe that we in Singapore can actually be part of the ecosystem that will drive the sustainable growth in the region. And I see that there are questions about how we can standardize in Southeast Asia and can have a more collaborative approach. Given the stage of development in Singapore vis-a-vis other countries in the region, probably we have a great opportunity to provide the leadership in terms of standardized processes, systems, precedences of waste to energy, for example, or renewable energy. All these things can become a good reference for the countries in the region to benefit from. The biggest opportunity, I guess, is also in the storage space. We believe that a lot has to happen in the storage for renewable energy and clean and green energy to kind of become mainstream in a big way. And this is where the focus for the next 3 to 5 years research would be, to get storage sorted in terms of cost of storage.
If I should take Kavita's question, and going back to the analogy of driving a car and approaching a crossroad, and this change from financial language to non-financial language, I think today, if you're driving your car, you see, and that's very much contextualized to Singapore and Asia, being rule-driven, you have all signs about speed limits. So everyone understands the speed limit of 50 kilometers per hour. But what if that sign in the future would be the limit of emissions that you're allowed to emit on the road? So I think it doesn't really matter, even in a rule-driven economy. It's all about how you actually engage the community. So to answer your question, I can picture signs going forward where you're saying max limit of emissions being X, Y, Z. We start seeing in shipping, in maritime, is something that we start seeing, right? So why not using a little bit the same thinking also for rule-based economies?
Right.
Yeah, make it visible.
Right. Thank you, Corrado. Sharad, I just wanted to add to your point about Singapore taking leadership. I just wanted to give a quick input there. We have set up a working group where we are trying to standardize together, of course, under the leadership of our standardization organization, and we are doing standards for renewable energy certificates, RECs. So right now in Asia, there are no rules or regulations around RECs. So together with ESG, we are trying to, and NEA, CES and NEA are the co-conveners for that working group on REX. We are trying to see how could we have a robust standard of what constitutes a REC and how do you count it? How do you make sure it's not double counted? How do you make sure it's a very robust REC originating from Singapore? And then the hope is that the similar kind of standard may be adopted by the region.
Yep.
You know, so that would be a sort of an example for what you're mentioning in terms of taking leadership. And there could be so many such areas where Singapore could take leadership.
Yeah.
Yep. Agree, Kavita. Yep.
Yeah. I will take Horn's question, addressing a little bit the cultural aspect of it. I agree, roundabouts are very pleasurable, and that's why I like to think ESG as something pleasurable. What we need to take into account, that was a little bit what I mentioned speaking about the dialects, the local context plays a role. So when it comes to Singapore and roundabouts, we also need to make sure that there is sufficient space to do it. And I think you will see different type of roundabouts, hybrid versions of it, emerging in respect of a country's limitation. And that's a very important aspect. That's why I was mentioning it's not a universal language per se. I think the language is giving you some baseline, some standards, some targets that you can relate to, but how you will be implementing it is also much depending on the constraint that you have, whether it's geographically or in the sense of building a roundabout in Singapore, and the reason maybe you have so few, physically you don't have the space. But what I'm saying is more the mindset around it. I think that's what you can educate, is the mindset to really have a more self-sufficient, self-organized way of looking at ESG, and thereby bringing a different perspective into assessment, risk, and opportunities.
I think that question on will COVID accelerate, I think as I was highlighting in my presentation, we believe that it is probably a tipping point where, like renewable energy, sustainable investment and sustainability measures through ESG lens will become all the more prevalent in all organizations in both developed as well as developing markets. And this is not only because of being a responsible corporate citizen or wearing only the ESG lens. I think this is primarily because it makes immense commercial sense, and the whole survival of an organization will depend going forward on being having sustainable practices.
And then as a final note on this language being spoken now, and probably that will be for the next webinars, Kavita. But now there are so many data that are being actually aggregated by startups, by credit scoring agencies, whether it's Standard & Poor's, Moody's, but also a number of new startups. They are collecting all data that is publicly available, and they are also having their own data, and they start scoring you how good a driver you are in terms of sustainability. And I think back to Hank's point, that's probably even helping building the mindset when all of a sudden you need to start reacting on someone else giving you a score. Yeah, so you can even picture the idea that all of a sudden you will have ESG officers, not police officers, giving you a score in how well you are actually complying with the ESG languages and features.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I think if there are no more questions, we have just about reached the end of our hour, and it's been a very stimulating conversation with both Sharath and Corrado. And this is not the last. I think please stay tuned. There'll be more. And I think in the forthcoming webinars, we will take a deeper dive into specific questions, specific areas, so there can be a better understanding of certain topics, especially, for example, sustainable finance is such a huge topic, Corrado. You alluded to it, and so did Sharad. But I think we can go much deeper into that topic of sustainable finance and many such other topics with KPMG. So I do thank both of you profusely for coming on today and participating with us in this webinar. For our participants, thank you so much. You tune in every week, and we hope that we are able to get across some information to you that's useful. And as always, we ask you to fill in a little poll that has just popped up on your screen. That helps us to calibrate our topics better. And also, if you're enjoying our webinars, or should we just think of doing something else? So please do take a minute to fill that up. And with that, very big thank you again, Sharad and Corrado, and thank you to all our participants who tuned in this morning. Thanks a lot.
Be safe on the
Yes,
street,
thank
on
you
the
all.
road. Bye.
The poll will be up for about 30 seconds. So with those who need more time to fill up, we'll leave it running for a while more.